studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali. It's Friday, March 13th, 2015. We'll speak with Dr. David Perlmutter, author of the best-selling book Grain Brain, about the latest dietary guidelines and how they've changed with respect to cholesterol consumption. And CEO pay continues to rise. We'll examine a new report on bonuses. Plus, Japanese-American poet Amy Uyematsu joins us in studio to discuss her new collection, The Yellow Door. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Cristina Mislan. She is an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. Hi, Cristina.
Hello, Sonali.
The Islamic State is celebrating a major victory in the latest in the U.S.-led war in northern Iraq. ISIS militants blew up an Iraqi army headquarters in Ramadi, killing 40 Iraqi soldiers. A U.S. military spokesperson claimed that Iraqi forces have successfully repelled ISIS from the area. The Ramadi fight comes at the same time as Iraqi forces, Shia militias, and Iranian troops are fighting a major battle to retake the city of Tikrit. Meanwhile, in a disturbing new development, ISIS says it has accepted a pledge of allegiance from the Nigerian group Boko Haram. Recently, Boko Haram's propaganda efforts have been seen to bear ISIS's hallmarks. Boko Haram has taken responsibility for killing thousands of people in the past few years in Nigeria alone and has recently lost military ground to an international coalition. Cristina, do you see signs that both ISIS and Boko Haram might be losing their wars?
Well, I do think that there's definitely some consensus among international voices, especially in Iraq and on the African continent, that ISIS and Boko Haram are losing ground. But, I think there's an important lesson here that we need to take away is that what we're seeing is that these regional and international coalitions are way more effective than, for instance, Western-led or U.S.-led coalitions against these against ISIS and Boko Haram. So I think that's an important lesson that we can take away from that. And so hopefully what we can learn is that there are people fighting for their own survival, and the U.S. and Western Europe are not always necessarily need to be involved.
Here in the United States, despite the public outrage over the National Security Agency's mass surveillance program, the Senate Intelligence Committee yesterday passed the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act. The act has long been pursued by the NSA, and it would make it easier for private companies to share consumer information with the government. The lone dissenting voice in the committee was from Senator Ron Wyden, who worried that it was a, quote, surveillance bill by another name. The bill has gained momentum in the wake of the Sony hacking scandal last year, but still faces major opposition in the House and Senate at large. Senate Intelligence Committee Vice Chair Dianne Feinstein defended the bill, saying it would, quote, only be used for counterterrorism purposes and at certain immediate crimes. So, Cristina, do you see the senators' votes as hypocritical, given that last year, when they were up in arms, when they discovered that the CIA had spied on this committee, especially Senator Feinstein, who's vigorously defended the NSA at every turn?
Yeah, of course, definitely it's hypocritical. I mean, we shouldn't be surprised that they would care more about their own surveillance than the surveillance of the public. But I think, it's interesting that we see that Washington doesn't learn from its own mistakes and from its history. And so I think it's really important to understand. I'm reminded, for instance, of Naomi Klein's argument about the corporatist structure that we live in. And right now we're seeing surveillance at the center of that relationship between between private companies and the government. And I think, it's definitely interesting how there's the surveillance state that we live in. We need to see that we're all in that surveillance state, right? And so when it's such a pervasive institution that no one can escape that institution.
And of course, in this particular case, we're talking about private data as well, consumer data that private companies collect. The U.S. Department of Energy has just released a report entitled Wind Vision, a new era of wind power in the United States, which paints an optimistic picture of the renewable energy source. Together with solar, wind power generated electricity grew a lot faster in 2014 compared to fossil fuel-based electricity. The data paves the way for fulfilling a key goal of the Obama administration, administration to source 35% of the U.S.'s electricity needs by the year 2050. The report attributes the growing success of wind power to two main policies: technology cost reductions and federal and state policy support. The report also touted the win-win benefits of wind, curbing climate change and providing green jobs. Cristina, are you heartened by this report, and will it be enough to silence the naysayers?
I'm definitely heartened by the report. It's nice to see when President Obama is doing good things. But I have to say, I'm less optimistic about anything silencing naysayers. As we have seen in the past, climate change deniers are going to deny it, and it seems like it seems at first on surface level irrational and illogical arguments that naysayers will make and people who deny climate change and global warming. But actually, I think there are economic interests at stake here, right? And so when you're talking about politicians who are in the hands of big oil, a conversation about energy and a conversation that's about alternative energy sources, big oil is going to definitely see their economic interests at stake. And again, the relationship between the private industry and Washington is huge. And so a lot of times I think that some of this denial really comes from rational arguments that really is about economic interest.
I want to thank you very much, Cristina, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Cristina Mislan is an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali. Did you know that Uprising is now a TV show as well as a radio show? We rely on subscribers to our YouTube channel to fund the TV production of Uprising, and you can sign up to be a subscriber at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. After 40 years of advising Americans to avoid cholesterol like the plague, the government's Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee is considering a new set of rules. Now that the health-conscious among us have gotten used to ordering egg white omelets, refusing steak, and drinking skimmed milk, the nation's top nutrition panel has said, well, maybe cholesterol is not as bad for you as we once thought. In the panel's words, it is no longer a, quote, nutrition of concern. Members of the panel arrived at the conclusion in December, and now their recommendations are set to be included in a formal report that will have deep ramifications in how nutritionists, doctors, and others advise Americans to eat, and on how school lunches and food stamp programs are designed. The U.S. has been the only country in the world to single out cholesterol consumption as a problem. New research has shown that cholesterol does not have the feared impact on risks of heart disease, diabetes, and hypertension as was once thought. In 2013, even the American College of Cardiology and the American Heart Association examined the studies on which the old cholesterol guidelines were based and found that there was, quote, insufficient evidence. We turn now to Dr. David Perlmutter. He's a recently retired board-certified neurologist, fellow of the American College of Nutrition. He's a recipient of the Linus Pauling Award for his innovative approaches to neurological disorders and the Denham-Harman Award for his pioneering work in free radical science and its application on clinical medicine. He's also the author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, Grain Brain, The Surprising Truth About Wheat, Carbs, and Sugar. Welcome to Uprising, Dr. Perlmutter.
Glad to be here. Hi.
Hi, thanks for joining us. Well, what do you make of the new consensus by the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, specifically on cholesterol? Is it about time?
Well, you know, when you realize that humans have been eating high cholesterol foods for 2 million years, and it's only been in the past couple of decades that this aberration, the scientizing of our food, the recommendation that we should reduce cholesterol based upon some really silly animal studies came to the forefront, really in a way to allow, for example, the use of cholesterol-lowering drugs. So it is certainly about time that we return to a level of sanity and began to give back to the human body what it has always needed to live, to survive, and to be resistant to disease, and in my business, to be resistant even to brain disease. We need cholesterol in the diet. We need to have good, healthy cholesterol levels in our bodies, and that doesn't mean low cholesterol levels in the bodies. It means adequate amounts. Our bodies are desperate for cholesterol, which has been demonized, as you well said, over the past several decades.
So you refer to these animal studies. I understand the original studies were on rabbits, which found that when rabbits were fed, essentially direct cholesterol, their cholesterol levels in their blood went up. But years later, when that same study was replicated in other animals, there was no effect. And so it just turned out that rabbits specifically were more sensitive to this, but we aren't rabbits.
Well, we're not rabbits, that's for sure. But I mean, that study, the original study was done in Russia in 1913, and they fed laboratory animals, in this case rabbits, a food that they would never in their history have consumed. Rabbits are vegetarians, so they would never, by definition, have consumed any cholesterol. There is no cholesterol in plants. It's only found in animal products. So here, right off the bat, the study is flawed. You're giving an animal something it never would have eaten. Humans, on the other hand, have long eaten cholesterol foods. We've long eaten meat and fish and poultry and eggs, over the past couple of million years. So it's a good, natural type of food for us. And it is welcomed that the governmental advisory panel, in their 571 pages, came to the conclusion that, in fact, there is no science supporting any relationship between dietary cholesterol and dreaded things like coronary artery disease. And moreover, we're now seeing an abundance of science indicating that, in fact, cholesterol is good for the brain. Those individuals with the lowest cholesterol levels have the highest risk of developing dementia, for example.
Now, we should mention that there is a certain percentage of the human population that is sensitive to cholesterol, for whom cholesterol intake can be quite bad. However, the old recommendations, applied those standards to the entire population, right?
Well, that's true, but I mean, I think what we're now seeing about individuals who may be so-called cholesterol sensitive is that actually it's not the total amount of cholesterol in their systems that seems to be the problem, but whether or not the cholesterol, and more specifically the carrier of cholesterol, LDL, which somehow obtained the moniker of being bad cholesterol over the years. Whatever marketing genius figured that one out gets a prize, I'm sure. But that said, when the carrier of cholesterol becomes oxidized or damaged by the action of free radicals, that becomes an issue. And oddly enough, the oxidation or damage to LDL, or bad cholesterol, happens when blood sugar is elevated. So the higher the blood sugar, the more damage there is to LDL, and the more it becomes a player in the realm of causing a coronary artery disease and other problems. So it gets us to another important description in the new guidelines, and that is that the big player here, despite what the agricultural industry would like us to believe, the big player is sugar and refined grains. That's what the report really emphasizes, that the biggest issue that where we've been misled, although they didn't use that terminology, is our consumption of carbohydrates, sugars, and refined grains. So
now I understand that the committee did. You're right that the issue of sugar was pretty prominent, which is, I think, quite a big step. However, the committee still, insisted that whole grains were a very important part of a healthy diet. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that with this first pass, they've at least characterized refined grains as being an issue, and I think whole grains will follow. The problem with whole grains is that they have a very high, what we call glycemic index, meaning they dramatically increase blood sugar for an extended period of time, and that is lethal for humans in terms of health. Now, the other side of the whole grain argument is, well, they provide a rich source of fiber. And as Mark Bittman correctly pointed out recently in the New York Times, we as humans are dramatically deficient in Western cultures in terms of our fiber consumption. So the argument seems to be that while whole grains are negative because of their carb issues and sugar issues, yet maybe to some degree that is offset because of the fact that they give humans who are deprived of fiber some fiber. But hopefully with time, people are going to get back to eating a diet that's naturally higher in fiber without having to rely on consuming grains that will spike the blood sugar.
Well, Dr. Perlmutter, the committee has taken a position not just on cholesterol and sugar, but also in general, the original recommendations on saturated fats is an important question. The New York Times, in its coverage of the panel's conclusion, said this: the advisory panel was criticized for its advice against saturated fat, which has been challenged by several recent studies. The paper quoted a prominent cardiologist who said that, quote, replacing saturated fat with the polyunsaturated fats and vegetable oils could worsen blood cholesterol levels and raise cancer and heart disease risk. The cardiologist went on to say the recommendations on saturated fat are a farce. Those are strong words. Do you agree?
They are strong words, and I'm in 100% agreement because they are scientifically validated. They are factual. When you substitute saturated fat for these so-called polyunsaturated vegetable oils, you are dramatically increasing your risk for what is called oxidative damage to the fat, or rusting, if you will. But also these vegetable oils that are so prominent on the grocery store shelves, the corn oil, etc., are very high in what are called the omega-6 group of fatty acids. And those are devastating in terms of their ability to increase inflammation. And why that's germane is because inflammation is the cornerstone of heart disease, diabetes, cancer, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, autism, you name it. Really, anything bad that you don't want to get the mechanism is to some degree inflammatory. So as we were told over the years to increase our consumption of these vegetable oils high in the pro-inflammatory omega-6s, that was bad advice. So cardiologists like Dr. Stephen Sinatra have long been warning us about these vegetable oils and how devastating they were. And so I think that the committee, in terms of the idea of the polyunsaturated versus saturated, this is important information. Let me finish one point. In April of 2014, in the journal Annals of Internal Medicine, was the largest study ever conducted, a meta-analysis published in the Annals of Internal Medicine of more than 500,000 individual cases, showing that there was no risk increase for heart disease in people consuming the highest amount of the dreaded saturated fat. So this is a food that humans have been consuming for over 2 million years, and interestingly enough, 50% of the fat in human breast milk is saturated fat. Our bodies are desperate for it.
So, but aren't there scores of studies showing a correlation between the intake of saturated fat and coronary disease and this complex of diseases, diabetes and hypertension? It seems like every other month or so we read a study that's being reported that shows there might be a correlation that examines a certain population, what they eat, and then what their risks are. How do you explain that?
Well, there were scores of studies at one point that said the Earth was flat, too. And so I think that's what science is all about. And as I just mentioned, I mean, this was the largest meta-analysis, meaning a look at every study, every meaningful study in the area ever performed, and it was just published. So it was a retrospective looking at some of the very studies that you talk about, indicating that in point of fact, when you applied a good analysis technique to the studies, they were either flawed or actually did not truly have data that supported the conclusion that there was any danger whatsoever to a food that humans have always eaten.
And of course, correlation isn't causation, right?
Yeah, I mean, the idea that humans should avoid saturated fat is brand new. I mean, that's only several decades old, and it's wrong. I mean, we know what has allowed you and me to have this conversation today. In other words, humans to survive has been that we've always eaten foods that had rich amounts of saturated fat, meat and eggs and poultry, and supplemental things like coconut oil, which is more than 90% saturated fat. The dreaded saturated fat is a health-giving food supply. I mean, and that's brand new, the idea that coconut oil, for example, can lead to health. Just published only just 2,000 years ago in the Vedic texts talking about the health benefits of coconut oil. Who knew?
Well, Dr. Perlmutter, I can imagine for our audience that this all sounds extremely confusing. The government's Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, for years, first we were told butter is bad and so we should eat margarine. Then we found out that the fats in margarine, which are trans fats, hydrogenated oils, are actually the causes of some of these diseases we were going to get from butter. So we stopped eating those. And to the committee's credit, they did point out trans fats, but they left alone their recommendations against saturated fat. And we've had this, these contradictory recommendations again and again and again. And it just is a very difficult thing for people to navigate. We're told not to eat red meat, egg yolks are bad for us, butter, etc. But now the tide is slowly turning on that. Sugar is finally being indicted. And I'm wondering, does the fact that the last 40 years of recommendations has coincided with some of the biggest increases in the very same complex of diseases we've been warned against kind of say it all?
You couldn't have said it any better. When we begin scientizing our foods and having scientists tell us what we should eat with their recommendations being influenced by industry to sell products, that has been the cause of so much illness in Western cultures. I think to answer the question about the confusion on the part of the public in terms of what they're being told by the so-called experts, I would say take a step back and don't listen to experts. Just ask yourself, what have we always eaten? What has allowed humans as a species to survive? And understand that, well beyond our discussions of fat, carbohydrates, protein, and the micronutrients of minerals and vitamins, you have to understand that food is actually information. Food is a signal to our DNA. Our DNA changes in its expression moment to moment based upon the foods that we eat. Our DNA hasn't changed for tens of thousands of years and has responded quite appropriately to allow our survival by responding to the foods that were available. Carbohydrates and sugars have never been available to humans. There were never any wheat fields and apple orchards and orange juice bottles hanging from trees. What we did have was an abundance of vegetables growing under the ground, above the ground, and animal products that were based upon what we either killed or that were already dead and we scavenged. That was the information that was communicating with our genome. Now, suddenly, in the past 100 years or so, we are sending these aberrant signals to our DNA, and the outcome has been exactly what you described, all of these ill health effects. Had we had this level of heart disease, cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's, etc., for the past several hundred years, we wouldn't have survived. So, yes, carbs, for example, are worthwhile because they're transportable and they don't spoil, but they're not an ideal food for humans to be consuming, that's for sure.
Well, Dr. Perlmutter, I'd be remiss in asking you this because I'm sure a significant proportion of our audience might still not be convinced by what you're saying. And I know that there's a strong push among some sectors of our society to embrace a vegan lifestyle and vegan diets, convinced that that is the healthiest diet, not just for human beings, but also for the planet, with claims that cattle production and livestock just have too big an environmental impact, etc. So how do you respond to those?
I would say that I think that what you should embrace is the idea that, for example, in the book Grain Brain, where I talked about what is ideal for humans to be eating, this is not a push for eating a lot of meat and a lot of animal products. That the main part of the plate, as a practical measure, should be filled with above-ground, nutrient-dense, fiber-rich, colorful vegetables. That the meat part of the diet should be relegated to being the side dish, or even at times the garnish. And I would agree with the China study, for example, and others who have indicated that there is risk in consuming lots of red meat, because by and large, the meat that you would buy at the grocery store would be something I would never eat, nor would I even touch it. Why? Because the meat that is sold in your grocery store is by and large fed grain, much of which has been sprayed with herbicides. Some of the foods that are given to cattle, the corn, for example, is genetically modified. And feeding a cow corn increases the levels of omega-6s in the meat. And as I indicated earlier, that is a cause, that's a relationship to increasing inflammation. So by and large, the meat and the eggs and the dairy products are not quality foods. So what you hear me saying is that we have to qualify those recommendations about eating animal products to be clear that these are free-range chicken or animals that have been raised with organic food, that have been grass-fed in terms of meat. You know, it's true that it takes an awful lot of grain to make a pound of beef from cattle, but cattle in their normal natural environment never ate grain in the first place. They ate grass. And that creates meat that has higher levels of omega-3, which is brain protective, heart protective, immune balancing, and lower levels of the pro-inflammatory omega-6s. So, you know, it's like saying, well, let's do a study of alcohol consumption and make no differentiation between whether a person drinks Merlot or drinks Scotch. And obviously, you're going to get different results based upon those two choices. Same thing with meat and dairy and chicken, poultry, etc.
You know, one of the things, finally, that doesn't come up when we talk about the diseases that are linked with what we eat are the diseases of the brain. And of course, you're a neurologist, and your book is about how our foods impact our brains. Finally, can you, what do you make of the fact that the Nutrition Guidelines Advisory Committee didn't really address and often doesn't address the issue of this very disturbing rise in brain-related diseases? Yes, we know heart disease and diabetes have been around and are huge killers of people, but we're seeing equally disturbing rises in Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, etc., and also among children, autism, and these diseases of the brain that nobody really seems to understand. But you seem to have a pretty strong theory, and your practice, I understand, has also shown you a lot.
I'll say yes to both of those statements, or confirm both of those statements. For some reason, the brain has been left out of these discussions on nutrition, and it turns out that the brain is actually exquisitely sensitive to our nutritional, our dietary choices, even more so than the heart and immune system and things like diabetes. The brain is exquisitely sensitive to the products made by the gut, by the very bacteria that live within the gut, for example. But just taking a step back, high-fat diets are good for the brain. Cholesterol is good for the brain. Sugar is devastating for the brain. In a recent study appearing in the August 2013 issue of the New England Journal of Medicine, a striking correlation was found between even subtle elevations of blood sugar and risk for dementia, risk for Alzheimer's, a disease for which there is no treatment. So it's the reason I wrote Grain Brain. It's the reason I did public television programs about this, because you know, we can prevent the very diseases that you mentioned, the very diseases that we fear the most, and we can do it with dietary changes. The notion that there is a heart-smart diet and that somehow it would be different from a brain-smart diet or a diet to reduce risk of diabetes, that doesn't make any sense. There's obviously one diet recommendation, one type of approach that's best for humans that has allowed our survival, and that is the diet that I have described. I think in moving forward into the future, what we're now embracing is the powerful role of the gut bacteria, the human microbiome, in terms of its effects upon our health, and specifically upon brain health, the risk of developing Alzheimer's, autism, ADHD, depression, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's, you name it. very much dependent upon the bacteria that live in the gut, and those bacteria are nurtured or not by the very food choices that we make. My new book is called Brain Maker. It has to do with the power of gut microbes to determine your brain's destiny. And that'll be out April 28th of this year, coming out actually next month.
And we had in fact just interviewed recently on our program Dr. Martin Blazer about his book, Missing Microbes, that touches on a lot of what you just mentioned.
It does, and exactly what Dr. Blazer is talking about in his book has to do with caring for the microbiome, the gut bacteria. And one of the points that he makes, I think, that is very profound, is that not only our overusage of antibiotics in terms of taking an antibiotic every time you get the sniffles, but also the crazy overusage of antibiotics, or even usage of antibiotics in raising cattle,
right.
For example, in America, makes no sense, is changing the complexion of the gut bacteria, and as he talked about, may well play a role in, for example, childhood obesity. So in the new book, Brain Maker, we actually spend quite a bit of time quoting his material because it's very, very good.
I want to thank you so much, Dr. David Perlmutter, for joining us today and helping to make some sense of these confusing recommendations.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Dr. David Perlmutter is my guest. He's a recently retired board-certified neurologist, fellow of the American College of Nutrition, and author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, Grain Brain, The Surprising Truth About Wheat, Carbs, and Sugar. When we come back, we'll examine a new report on CEO bonuses, and then poet Amy Uyematsu joins us in studio. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. A new report by the Institute for Policy Studies has come to an obscene conclusion that the financial industry's 2014 bonuses were double the combined earnings of all Americans who work full-time at the federal minimum wage. Based on figures just released by the New York State Comptroller, it turns out that Wall Street banks handed out to CEOs an unimaginable $28.5 billion in bonuses, not salaries, but bonuses, those extra perks that executives get on top of their hefty salaries. There are currently 1,007,000 Americans who earn the very low federal minimum wage of just $7.25 an hour. These are workers whose resident states or municipalities only require the very outdated wages set by the federal government to form their base pay. All of those Americans combined, twice them, earned as much money last year as 167,000 Wall Street execs got in bonuses. What's worse, corporate profits actually dipped while bonuses rose. And wages as a whole across the entire economy fell by 0.1% despite rosy economic outlooks. My guest is Bartlett Naylor. He's the financial policy advocate in Public Citizens Congress Watch Division. Welcome to Uprising.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, honestly, as I was looking through these numbers, they made me sick. Is income inequality worse than it's ever been? And do these bonuses sort of symbolize the worst of it?
Yes, I think they do. Income inequality, as you correctly, I think, frame it, the disparity between the jobs in the real economy and jobs on Wall Street are an extraordinary problem. And in Wall Street, the bonus figures, for example, that were released a few days ago by the New York Comptroller are for a job that is sometimes difficult to explain, or at least justify the social value thereof. These are traders who are essentially moving money around, and to the extent that we need banking to intermediate between savers and users of credit, well, this trading is sort of a self-justified exercise. The $28 billion that you refer to is coming from somewhere. It's not the creation of an important new product, but it is coming from the real economy.
And let me just clarify the statement I made earlier. The 1,007,000 or so Americans who earn the federal minimum wage, together their combined earnings are about half of what these bonuses are. If corporate profits fell, slightly last year. How do they justify the rise in bonuses? And in fact, what purposes do bonuses serve at all? I don't get bonuses. I don't think anybody I know gets a bonus.
Yes, and these bonuses are on top of a salary, which I think the controller did not release those figures, but last year it was roughly $350,000. So the average is something
That's
over,
a base pay.
Yeah, so base pay plus bonus is you're getting over $500,000. This is not rocket science. This is presumably has some value. We can explore that. But we actually looked at rocket science as well at NASA, for example. The top rocket scientist makes $130,000 less than the bonus of a Wall Street trader.
Wow. Now, don't these bonuses actually have a negative impact in that they might be able to, or might be encouraging the very kinds of risky behavior that led to the 2008 crash?
That's right. In fact, and we've seen this play out in Congress, for example, one of the larger traders in Wall Street, for example, is Citigroup, and they're using, in many cases, taxpayer-insured deposits, which are that's very cheap money. I mean, ask yourself how much you're getting in interest on your checking account and so forth. And they're using that for this money shuffle, they use fancy words like derivatives trading. And they actually got passed through Congress, a bill that Citigroup actually wrote, the ability to, in fact, use the FDIC part of Citigroup's bank to engage in this trading. And again, it has very little to do, I don't think it has much to do at all with the real economy. It's just bets. Just one other fact, apparently the controller's been tracking these numbers since 1986, I think, and then the bonus was $14,000. So it's gone up more than tenfold since then, and I don't think we can say that the economy has gotten 10 times better, on the contrary.
Right. And the economic stimulus effect of these bonuses is likely to remain in the sort of luxury goods sector. But if the federal minimum wage was raised to the healthy $15 an hour that many groups around the country are asking for, wouldn't we have a greater overall positive impact on the economy?
That's right. So if you deconstruct how these bonuses are being used, I mean, a lot of it is being saved, or it's being put in investments. Whereas a minimum wage worker, even if that minimum wage worker's money is doubled, they are all spending that money. They have to on food and housing and so forth. It's called the multiplier effect. So the multiplier effect for a job at the lower income is much higher than, say, in this, where, okay, some restaurants in New York City and so forth, and luxury clothing or automobiles may be boosted in New York City, but not really in the real economy elsewhere.
Now, all that is, of course, needed to force the very same companies that are paying their executives these obscene bonuses to instead pay their workers slightly higher base wages is for Congress and the president to increase the federal minimum wage. But Congress has been standing very strongly in the way. I mean, is it because Wall Street has effectively just bought off members of Congress, especially Republicans?
Yes, well, Wall Street's grip on Washington is extreme. 3,000 bank lobbyists spending a collective $1.5 million each and every day. And you can see why. Again, Citigroup had its bill passed by Congress as part of the CR Omnibus, the Continuing Resolution Omnibus, back in December to further enable this. The default position of a member of Congress, both Republican and Democrat, is that they are getting these contributions from Wall Street, and if a Wall Street bill comes up, it's to approve it. And it takes a good deal of effort to show these members of Congress that they're doing damage.
And Bartlett, not only are Republicans refusing to raise the minimum wage as they serve many of these same corporations, they're also standing in the way of President Obama's efforts to, for example, tax offshore corporate profits. There's currently $2.1 trillion stashed offshore, and taxing it would generate, something like $500 billion of government revenue, which could fund crucial infrastructure projects, provide jobs for people. Again, there's political gridlock. Can we break this political gridlock?
Well, in the end, what we need is public financing of elections, because as long as there is such a very valuable opportunity for profit, those companies will make the rational decision to make the contributions to members of Congress and engage in other lobbying activity to sustain that source of profit. So until we have actual one person, one vote, as opposed to $1, one vote, we've got a serious problem.
And finally, on the issue of wages increasing, the latest jobs report initially found to have a very, very tiny upward pressure on wages after adjusting. It was found that actually wages are still not rising. There's still negative wage increases. But a lot of economists have a very rosy outlook these days. Maybe they're being influenced by the size of the bonuses of the CEOs going up. But what do you make of these forecasts that wages are just going to go up if we just let the market let it do its magic?
Well, economists live in statistics, and they can look at temperature extremes of 120 and -40 and see that things are at 72, and that's fine. And yes, there are winners, but unfortunately there are far too many losers. That, as you said at the outset, income inequality is severe. And I don't think we can be sanguine about a situation where maybe Wall Street brokers and dealers are making bonuses that put them over $500,000 a year, whereas so many people are struggling doing real work but not being paid fairly.
Well, Bartlett, I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
My guest, Bartlett Naylor, is a financial policy advocate in Public Citizens Congress Watch Division, and we've been talking about a new report just released by the Institute for Policy Studies on the obscene benefits that Wall Street obscene bonuses that Wall Street CEOs are getting. This is Uprising. After this break, we'll hear about a new book of poems by Amy Uyematsu. It's called The Yellow Door. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. An examination of American pop culture reveals that stereotypes of Asian Americans abound. There are few Asians on our screens, and the new sitcom Fresh Off the Boat is one small attempt to undermine the absence. Today, we end our program with a conversation with Japanese-American poet and teacher Amy Uyematsu. Born after World War II, Uyematsu has lived in Los Angeles all her life. She's the co-editor of Roots, an Asian-American Reader, which is a widely used anthology in academia. Her earlier poetry publications included 30 Miles from J-Town, Nights of Fire, Nights of Rain, and Stonebow Prayer. Her latest book is entitled The Yellow Door, just out from Red Hen Press. Amy Uyematsu now joins me in studio. Welcome to Uprising.
Thank you, Sonali.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, first, in reading for this interview and preparing for this interview, I was reading that you embraced the idea of, quote, being a curious, sometimes furious yellow. That made me smile. What does that mean?
Well, actually, when I was younger, I think the phrase was really turned around. I was more a furious, sometimes curious yellow. I grew up in the Sierra Madre, Pasadena area of LA, in a white suburb, and this was in the 50s and 60s, so it's still pretty close to World War II's end. My being called Jap in the classroom was commonplace. There wasn't a single line about my parents and grandparents being interned at Gila and Manzanar. So that was kind of the climate. As far as the curious part of that phrase, I was always curious about knowing more about my own history and the history of Asian Americans, as well as other people of color in this country. And my curiosity extended to wanting to know more about Japan, because I was raised very Americanized. So, I'll come back to the furious part. I think the furious part drove me to write a college essay in my senior year called The Emergence of Yellow Power in America. And that got me a job at the UCLA Asian American Studies Center.
Wow.
And the same anger, I think, fueled the poems for my first book, 30 Miles from J-Town.
So how seriously uninformed are Americans still, even today, non-Asian Americans? How uninformed are they about Asians? There's, of course, the persistent model minority myth. For women, there are stereotypes of sexualization and submissiveness. And as someone who's written for academic readers about Asian Americans and been part of the field of study, are you surprised by how persistent some of the myths continue to be?
I'm not surprised, because racism against people of color in this country continues, as we've seen in Ferguson, for example. I think it's a little easier for Asian Americans who live in big cities where we have large populations, but still there are stereotypes. While there has been an improvement in understanding of the concentration camp experience, overall the history of Asian Americans is still largely unknown by the majority population. I'm surprised that people still tend to lump us together with new immigrants. They're surprised if you speak good English. They can't differentiate Japanese versus Chinese versus Korean, etc., and think it doesn't matter. And I also feel that TV and film coverage hasn't really changed much from when I was growing up. There are very few Asian American faces on the screen.
Right. So there's mostly tokenism, but of course I mentioned there's a new sitcom now. We'll see what that leads to.
Right.
Let's talk about your book of poetry, The Yellow Door. This is your new collection of poems. How deeply do you tackle this issue of identity politics, as well as the U.S.'s sort of historical legacy with respect to racism against Asians?
You know, I think all of my books try to include identity politics and Asian American history to some degree. And that's probably because my poetry roots can be traced back to my being a college activist and participating in the anti-war, ethnic studies, and women's movements of the 60s and 70s. So you'll find political themes in all of my books, although it's a core part of my writing, but not the only part of my writing. I've expanded.
Right. I'm wondering if you can read a piece for our audience. There's a piece in your book, The Yellow Door, called No Shade, named Mongoloid.
I'll be happy to read it. And I kept a yellow notebook for several years, and it ultimately led to some of the poems that are in The Yellow Door. And in the yellow notebook, I would keep poems and photos, postcards, and even paint swatches of different shades of yellow. Shades like imperial yellow, Aztec gold, straw hat, rising sun. It was very interesting. But for this poem, there was no shade named Mongoloid. From palest white to sunburned brown, a yellow undertone is enough to incriminate. Suitable for Chinatown hangings, grounds for holding yellow-stamped citizens behind barbed wire fences. When a young girl's skin has that sickly cast, she gets fashion sense early. Never wear amber, chartreuse, or bright canary. Disguise the tint in the cheeks with a pink foundation. She knows the rules for beauty, how yellow glows only with pretty blue eyes. In America, it's undisputed that yellow belongs on traffic signs and school buses, taxi cabs and rain slickers, but there is no hue called mongoloid, no smiley face hug for my Japanese mug.
Amy Uyematsu reading from her book, The Yellow Door. And I love how you bring up a political issue, a social issue of identity politics in a very beautifully poetic way that's also quite angry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Back
The furious part.
Curious, furious, yes.
And you mentioned earlier Asian American culture and ethnicities, of course, hardly homogeneous. They're very heterogeneous. I'm Asian, and I noticed that you touched on that also in some of your poetry. There's another poem that struck me that I really enjoyed called The Pendant, where you sort of raise the fact that there's people from all different Asian backgrounds in the United States, some of whom are new immigrants, right? And so I'm wondering if you can share this poem, The Pendant, for us.
Sure. The background of The Pendant is that I was at a car dealership with my husband in the San Fernando Valley, and we're in one of those big showrooms where most of the salesmen were white, except for possibly one salesman. And this poem is about that one salesman and myself. The Pendant. "Where is it from?" he asks. I look down at the green and orange stones engraved with Chinese characters. "Asia, maybe Thailand," I reply, ready to go on my way. But the young man steps closer, like those foreign-born who haven't learned the invisible lines of physical boundary, that distance respecting the female. I'm caught off guard when he lifts the necklace, his fingers almost touching my breast. "It's jade," no hesitation in his voice, and he unbuttons a shirt collar, revealing 3 slender rings on the chain around his neck. "These are jade, too. I'm from the Philippines." I search his face for features like mine. He claims he has some Chinese blood, while I see a freckled complexion and eyes set too deep. Reaching again for my pendant, he's making me nervous, his brief gesture so intimate. Almost greedily, he takes in my Japanese features, and I recognize that hunger for home in this crowded room where no one looks like me. Just before I turn away, he appeals, "I always wear jade."
The Pendant by Amy Uyematsu, reading for us from her book, The Yellow Door. Your poetry is very touching and very evocative, especially for people of color in this country who I think, listening to that, I could certainly relate to it. We don't hear enough about racism against Asian Americans in the United States, but of course it is pervasive. We mentioned earlier the stereotypes, and you brought up the internment camps that you mentioned that your parents were interned in during World War II, the horrible things that Japanese Americans went through. And you have a poem in your book called Haiku for the Unsuspecting Fortune Cookie Reader. It's a jarring poem, but it takes sort of head on the kinds of things that Asian Americans have been subjected to. And I'm wondering if you can read that poem now.
I'd be happy to read it, Sonali. And a little background. The poem is the result of my hearing about a trendy clothing store in the New York Soho area called Yellow Rat Bastard, of all things. And it's still there.
Wow.
This poem consists of 8 short haiku in the traditional 17-syllable style. There's a reference to Abercrombie and Fitch, who back in 2002, I believe, carried a racist line of T-shirts that had faces of Asians in caricature style. And the title I got just thinking about what would it be like if a person went to an Asian restaurant, expects their fortune cookie at the end of the meal, and when they open up the fortune cookie, they find some of these haiku messages. So this is called Haiku for the Unsuspecting Fortune Cookie Reader. It's only a joke. Yellow rat bastard T-shirts with cute matching bags. Feng shui and sushi are American staples. Yellow skin is not. Fortune Cookie says, Oriental eyes are fun. They can make you laugh. Some myths won't die. We're model minorities. We all speak Ching Chung. Fortune Cookie says, beware of Asian students, all smiles and A's. The shape of our eyes has been evidence enough. Un-American. Insults bring profits on Abercrombie t-shirts, $25 hip. Asian invasions. The trader's eyes are slanted. History as lie.
Amy Uyematsu, thank you so much for reading the haiku for the unsuspecting fortune cookie reader from your book, The Yellow Door. What do you hope readers take away from your book? And I'm wondering if you can also close with your short poem, Women's Lib Asian American Style, which I think is just a wonderful sort of empowering call.
I'm hoping the reader can learn something about Asian American history and culture, especially younger Asian Americans and younger people of color. And I hope people will think about the meaning of yellow in our culture. What yellow means to an Asian girl is certainly not the same as what it means to a blonde schoolmate. So I will read Women's Lib Asian American Style that has an epigraph by David Bowie's China Girl song. Oh, 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 ho, little China girl. I used to be called Oriental, equal parts Susie Wong, Japanese pearl, China doll, and geisha girl. I admit I'd been raised to nod and smile. But no way in hell was I ever going to grovel as your beaming ornamental. Never again your servile, oh so exotic, erotic yellow jewel.
Amy Uyematsu, thank you so much for joining us today, and best of luck with your book, The Yellow Door.
Thank you for having me, Sonali.
My guest, Amy Uyematsu, is the author of several poetry anthologies. Her latest, The Yellow Door. She's also the co-editor of Roots, an Asian American Reader. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. And Michael Casey is our research intern. Joseph Stone is our technical director. Federico Garcia and Kiana Turner are our audio engineers. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprisingwithsonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com, and our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. Have a wonderful weekend. I'll see you on Monday.